Greetings, YouTube. Today we're talking about Karen Armstrong's a short history of myth. A couple of blurbs here I think I should read. A handy standalone overview of the ever-evolving partnership between myth and man, hugely readable in its journey across epochs of human experience, often moving. An Armstrong characteristically insightful and eloquent book serves as a brilliant and thought-provoking introduction to myth in the broadest sense, and explains why, if we dismiss it, we do so at our peril. And when they say broadest, they mean broadest. This is not a big book, okay, and it reads very quickly. I think I only read this at work, and I read it in a week. I'm only reading at breaks and such. And it's part of that's because the font is fairly large. Now, the advantage of that is you go through a lot of pages in a short period of time. The disadvantage is because the paragraph breaks make it difficult to stop at a convenient spot. I tend to like to stop at the top of a page, and it wasn't always possible with this book. But she covers the Paleolithic era all the way up to the 21st century. So that's a really large swath of history from the earliest epochs of human existence till now. And the earlier discussions are based largely on archaeological evidence that we found, and you can't have an exact idea of what people thought and felt about myth and mythology in general until we walk into the historical era where we actually have written texts to refer to. However, once you have written texts, it isn't all that difficult to speculate that these written texts are based on something from the past. So, combining existing texts with extrapolation and archaeological evidence does help us piece together some views on myth that existed in eras prior to writing. Because let's be honest, as soon as writing arrived, it wasn't when mythology was invented. It just happened to be the first time it was recorded. And for me, she didn't really bring incredibly new concepts to the table until it entered into the era of the big religions, of the religions that have really shaped our modern era, and specific the three Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And for me, one of the things that she really brought to fore was the idea that a religious text, specifically the religious texts of these religions, cannot be taken literally. That these religious texts are meant to be read, are meant to be conveyors of an ethical worldview through metaphor, through poetic language. And if you pick them apart with a literalist point of view, you fail yourself on every level. And she uses the two terms which I think are very appropriate, and I think I will be using them in the future because I think they're so succinct and exact, which is myth and logos, myth and reason. When we have a mythological view of the world, it does not preclude the use of reason. I have often said for many, many years that anyone that thinks there's a dichotomy between myth and logos doesn't understand either of them. And I stand by that statement. Myth is important. And it was when we entered the Enlightened era, the Enlightenment, and people began to apply logos to myth, that I think that we started to get really lost. Prior to that, myths were rewritten constantly. And I don't just mean from author to author, but from telling to telling, from culture to culture, from person to person, the same myth, the same story being modified and changed to suit the situation at hand. And you're thinking, well, that's not a way to live your life, ever-changing worldview. That worldview can convey an ethical world framework. And just because the means of delivery changes over time doesn't mean that the lesson is not still valid. And that's important. But when they began to piece it apart It's much like cutting a human up into little cubes and then trying to find the soul. You may learn a whole lot about the person, but you're never going to find who they were. So once you do that, once you've pulled them apart like that, they're long gone. You've snuffed out who they are. And even if you're a person that believes that we are nothing but an electrical process inside the brain, that electrical process has been shut down and you're never going to find it. And you'll have to excuse Mandarin. She's old and a little grumpy. And that's the problem. Anyone that ever tells you the Bible is literal, it's word for word, literally, taken literally, has lost their way. They have not understood what the Bible is. And yes, I'm telling people who adhere to the Bible vehemently, who cleave to it like fingers on a cliff, keeping them safe, that they don't understand it. Because they're trying to apply logos to something that was never meant to have reason applied to it in that manner. The Bible is not a historical document. It is not a scientific document. It is metaphor. It is myth. It is there to help us conceive of an ethical worldview. Now, you can debate whether that ethical worldview is good or not. That's fine. But its message is snuffed out when you apply reason. And anyone that tries to replace reason with myth or myth with reason, again, has failed. There is no dichotomy. They are not interchangeable. And that's one of the problems we have in the modern world, is that too much of the myth has been replaced with logos. Too many people have lost their way because they don't have a mythical framework to live by. The symbolism around us, which surrounds us constantly, is invisible to them because they have taken the myth out of their life and they can no longer perceive it. If you put that myth back, you don't forego your reason. I can still be deeply involved in physics and biology and politics and all kinds of things that require the application of reason, of logos. But because I still hold on to the myth, because I still view the world through a mythological process, because of my spiritual and religious beliefs that have helped me achieve that, I live within a rich tapestry that others are blind to. And it's frustrating because I know what they're missing. And there's a reason that the world is stuck in this malaise where people are lost their way, where they become victims to things that they wouldn't have in the past, I don't think. Because they're trying to find that slot in their mind, in their life where myth lived, and they're replacing it with things that aren't myth. Our myths have been snuffed out in too many ways. And people are now latching onto anything because it fits that model, and they're not always healthy, like nationalism, jingoism, bigotry, because they have that sense of union with it, because demigods have taken up the mythological flag and now they wave it. We need our myths back. Old myths, new myths. Now, some of the closest things we have to that in the modern era are probably novels. And I've read a lot of them in my life, even though I no longer read them. And I think that one of the reasons I stopped is I got to the point where I saw too many of the same patterns. And at that time in my life, I had not really had as firm a grasp on what my own myths were yet. I was working on it. I had become a theist, and it had helped me begin to have a framework to work with. But I read so many of them. I saw so many of the same themes. What is it? There's only 3 actual storylines in the world or something like that. And all of this is brought to mind by this book. She really does an incredibly exemplary job in a short book to tell us and to show us the things that we've missed, the things that we've gotten wrong, that we let slip through our fingers and we shouldn't have, and we can bring them back. You can acquire, you can reignite the myth in your own life. Whether that's the myths of the past or the myths you write for yourself. You can live in a rich tapestry of symbolism, of ethical guidance in a way that logos cannot serve you. And remember, do not replace myth with the logos or logos with myth. They can live at the same time within you. There is no dichotomy. There is no confusion. It's all possible to hold it within you. We can be people of reason and of mythology at the same time. And Karen Armstrong, I think, does an excellent job in a short book of conveying that, of directing that, putting it into words far more eloquent than mine. So I highly recommend this book. This is an important book. This is a book that I think that a whole lot of people should read. Anyone that's a theist, anyone that's an atheist in the modern era needs to read this. Because if you are piecing your holy books apart with a magnifying glass, or if you dismiss them as irrelevant because they aren't historical documents, they aren't scientific documents, when they are never meant to be those things. If you were trying to replace myth with logos or logos with myth, you're doing it wrong. You're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing humanity a disservice. And you're missing out on the rich tapestry that it surrounds us every day.